Let's begin. So thank you all for joining. I am Kaylin Swingle, and I manage our customer support team. And I am getting to present one of my favorite topics today, so I'm very excited about that. And today's section on fuzzy matching will really be an introduction to fuzzy matching, and I'm going to review some content we haven't talked about in a while in one of these live sessions, and that is how to prepare your data for fuzzy matching and kind of some best practices and tips and tricks that really matter before you ever get to the fuzzy matching tool in order to ensure that the results you get out are what you expect. So a lot of today will be focused on data prep, and I will cover off on some of the basic settings for the fuzzy match tool. And I'll point out a particular training option if you want to get more in depth on some of the other content. So specifically, I'll start out by talking about the other trainings we have coming up. I'll give you some background on the workflow that I'm going to build out today. I'll actually build out the workflow, and then I'll cover resources at the end. Left this year in 2016, we have a training on forecasting, an introduction to that coming up on the 20th, and on the 27th, some of our favorite content from our users, tips and tricks, and we'll be covering Alteryx's most underrated tools. As always, you can visit our .com page and our training under resources, which I'll show, if you'd like to view upcoming trainings and review any past trainings that we've had. As always, you have resources available on the Alteryx community. This is going to be often your fastest way to get the answers you need. You don't have to wait for anybody else. Search the community, find the content you need, and continue moving about your project. We have a lot of active users. A lot of our ACEs and partners are on the community answering questions, providing ideas, and we would love for you all to get on the community. In the last few months, I've seen kind of an explosion of fuzzy matching questions and threads. So after this training, perhaps jump online and see if there's any unanswered questions that you could go with your new knowledge and help to solve. All right, so here's some background for what we're going to be covering today. The use case that we're going to work through to cover off on these fuzzy matching best practices and data prep skills is that we have two data sets. We have an existing customer file, which is our kind of our master file. It contains all of our existing customer data. And we have a new data set that represents the new customers from last month. Now, obviously, not all of Alteryx's customers deal with customer data. Many of you are in manufacturing, or maybe it's healthcare, telco. There's all sorts of different data types that are appropriate for fuzzy matching. This is just one use case. And our goal for today's use case is to try to understand which customers from last month are already contained in our customer file. And then, of course, vice versa, which ones are not. And the issue is that those files, and as is very common with any sort of name or address data, they're not exactly the same. It's very expected that there will be discrepancies, typos, different abbreviations, different spellings, all sorts of things that could cause the two data sets to appear to be different, when in reality we know there is a lot of overlap between our customers last month and our customers in our overall file. So the key concepts for today are fuzzy matching, and then, as I said, a big focus on data prep. You're seeing a screenshot of the workflow that I'm going to build out. I'll be going probably quickly during some of the setup phases. Again, today I'm really trying to hit home the importance of getting the data in the right format and what to expect coming out of the fuzzy match tool, and I'm less focusing on the actual configurations of the fuzzy match tool. So just be prepared for that and know that you received the workflow ahead of time if you want to open that up to kind of visually follow along. And you'll see some of the tools we're going to cover down below. You may be unfamiliar with a few of them. They may be tools you use all the time in different contexts, but I'm going to show you how they all play together when dealing with fuzzy matching. So, what is fuzzy matching? It's simply the ability to identify matches within data that are not exact. So there's some sort of threshold that says they're close enough, but they're not exact. They could be exact, but they don't have to be. And I pulled some quotes off of our community about fuzzy matching just to kind of get you in the right mindset about this content. There are absolutely facets of fuzzy matching that are a science. And there are sessions and there are knowledge-based articles about the science. The help file is a great place to go. But what I hope you take away from any fuzzy matching training that you attend from Alteryx is that it's also an art. There is an element to fuzzy matching that requires edits and kind of a continual process of improvement, going back, making changes, continuing that process over time, and kind of a little bit of trial and error. Today, I won't really get into much of the art piece of it. I'm going to talk really in black and white about what you need to do to your data to get what you want out of the tool. But just kind of be aware of that anytime you approach a process that you think fuzzy matching will be a fit for. You'll have to find a way to balance the science and the art. All right, so some of the things we're going to talk about are pre-fuzzy matching activities. And this checklist is going to really help ensure that you get what you want out of the fuzzy match tool. The very first thing that matters when doing a fuzzy match is assigning record ID. That is so you can identify the matches after the fuzzy match process. And you'll see I recommend assigning your own record ID from scratch, even if you think you already have one. I always prefer to assign my own, and I'll show you how to do that later. Things like case sensitivity and just general data cleansing is very, very important in the fuzzy matching process. What I like to say is anything that you know ahead of time is fuzzy. If you can get rid of it before the fuzzy match tool, it will actually give you more flexibility in the way you set up your thresholds and your algorithms, where you can let the fuzzy match tool do what it does best, which is kind of ignore discrepancies that otherwise a join, would throw out. But if you don't do the data cleansing ahead of time, you will have to set up your fuzzy match process in such a strict fashion to avoid the false positives that you'll end up missing a lot of the good data. So getting rid of words you don't need, getting rid of white space, any sort of data cleansing that, like I said, you know ahead of time might cause an issue. It is worth the effort, and it is actually going to empower the fuzzy match tool to do more for you. Okay. One of kind of an extra tidbit is that for our customers who subscribe to our spatial data, you get access to the CAS address standardization tools. And that will actually take address data, as the name implies, and standardize it according to the same standards that the U.S. Postal Service uses. And that in itself will also give you a lot more flexibility in the fuzzy match tool when you're setting up thresholds and choosing those algorithms. So it's all kind of one and the same. And again, this is for our customers who subscribe to our spatial data in the United States can use this. Finally, just the best practice is really anytime you're working in an Alteryx workflow is to get rid of fields you don't need. In the case of fuzzy matching, it just makes your life a little bit easier when you're configuring the fuzzy match tool and when you're doing joins later. So if you're going to match on name and address, then only keep name and address. Don't keep any extra fields. And you can always join back necessary fields at the end. Okay? So let's kind of go into the tools that we're going to cover in the workflow and give you kind of a heads up about what those tools do and why we're using them in the fuzzy match process. So the record ID tool in the preparation category we'll be using to assign our unique identifier to each of our records. Again, I recommend creating your own ID every time you build a fuzzy match process. There are reasons why. One of them is at the very bottom here, the note that if you're doing a merge, which means you're taking two separate data sets and actually trying to find matches. So imagine it's like a join, really. You have two data sets, you're trying to see which records are in both. It's very, very important for your ease of consumption that the record IDs don't overlap. So if you start one data set with a record ID of 1, you'll want to start the other set with a record ID of like 5 million. for instance. And if you are using IDs that already exist in your data, one, there could be duplicates that you'd need to worry about. Two, they may not follow this concept of non-overlapping. And just three, in general, with the fuzzy matching, anytime you're adding in a fuzzy element, I think controlling all of the other elements is the best practice. All right. Next is the data cleansing tool. This is a relatively new tool to Alteryx, so you may actually be working on a version of Alteryx that doesn't include this tool. Don't worry, I'll show you what you can do instead. But it turns out this tool is actually a macro that was created by an Alteryx employee as part of, I believe the first time it came out was just on the gallery as a useful tool, but we've embedded it in the product because it's so common and data issues are something that has to be addressed really regardless of your use case in Alteryx. And you'll see here some of the different options available in this tool without having to write formulas or do anything. And we'll utilize this tool as we prepare our data for fuzzy matching. If you don't have that macro downloaded or installed, or if you feel more comfortable creating your own rules for cleansing, you can always use the multi-field formula tool to modify a lot of columns at one time. This allows you to replace nulls and replace white space, delete characters, really whatever sort of formula you want to perform on each field. Really the only downside is this tool can perform one function on any number of fields, whereas the tool before, you'll see here you can choose as many fields as you'd like to perform any of these functions. So just keep that in mind, but if that data cleansing tool doesn't do exactly what you want or what you need, you always have the formula tool or the multi-field formula tool at your disposal to create completely custom expressions. Just a little overview on CAST, again, for those who either don't subscribe and are curious about it, or for those who do subscribe. It is that address standardization I talked about, and it does things like what you'd see here, kind of converting things into a consistent format. It'll also correct zip codes, which is very nice. The CAST tool itself looks like this. There are a lot of options that are available when you CAST certify an address. For the sake of fuzzy matching, you wouldn't need very many of these fields, but just to show you what's possible and the types of fields that are necessary to use the to use the CAST tool. So you need like city, state, and zip code and some sort of address. All right, now let's kind of talk about what I'm sure you guys feel is the star of the show. That's the fuzzy match tool. My very first point is data preparation is the key to success. So you can know everything in the world about the fuzzy match process, all of the match algorithms, the concepts involved in a successful fuzzy match. But if you don't do data prep, I have found you will not get the results you want from the fuzzy match tool. So that's why that's my very first point. There's really two options for the tool. You can dedupe one stream of data. And if you want to do that, you'd choose purge at the top here. Or if you're trying to join two data sets like I talked about earlier, that would be a merge. And anytime you do a merge, you specify which file the records are coming from, which I'm going to walk through. Kind of the big concept of fuzzy matching that's really important to understand when you go into the tool and then when you see the results coming out is that it's really a two-step process. And the first step is to generate keys that allow the fuzzy match tool to identify which records should be fuzzy matched. So not all the records get fuzzy matched. Only the records that pass the first step, the key generation, will actually go into the fuzzy match process. A very common kind of unknown fact about the tool. It's a two-step process, and the fuzzy match process is completely dependent on the key generation process. You will be able to set thresholds on a field basis. So for each field that you want to use in the join or the fuzzy match, you can say how similar that field needs to be to pass. And then, of course, overall, you get to decide here, out of all the match fields you use, what is the combined score that's necessary for you to be considered that a match? So you get to set thresholds in multiple places, and then they kind of all act together to then finally give you out the result, which is by default simply the record IDs that the fuzzy match tool identified as matches. That's all that comes out of the tool by default. So for instance, a join, which is probably the most common tool people are using when they dedupe, or when they are merging data sets, or a unique tool when they're deduping, those tools both give you back all the original fields by default. And that is not the behavior of the fuzzy match tool, and that throws people off. The behavior of the fuzzy match is to only give you the record IDs that match by default. And then you'll see some options at the bottom where you can check different behaviors or different output options, including match score or the keys that are generated for that step 1. And today, I'm really going to completely focus on the pre-configured match styles. So these things you see right here, match styles, I'm not going to talk a lot about customizing those. I'm just going to guide you through the pre-configured options and again, point you to the training if you want to know more about customizing that. All right, so as far as I know, no questions yet, but we're about to jump in after a couple of points on the fuzzy match tool options. So here are those pre-configured match styles I talk about. This is available in the help file, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide. In fact, I might have made one small change, but it could be completely copied and pasted if I recall. So don't worry, this information is available to you in our help file. And I'm just walking you through those pre-configured styles so you know kind of when to use them. But just understand, I'll say it again, there is a training that gets into potential changes and reasons why you might make those changes available to you. Okay, the fuzzy match process. It is a multi-step process, as I mentioned, and so I like this particular slide because it's important, I think, to break down the different steps if you're ever going to be satisfied with the results you're getting. So it's very possible from this first step to the last step that records are going to fall out. They're not going to be considered matches. And I have found the most common issue with the fuzzy match tool is that a record they thought should match doesn't, and the users don't know why. So that's why I'm showing you this waterfall so you can kind of understand all of the different filters that take place internally behind the scenes that you don't see, but that could cause a record not to come out of the match. So the very first step is, for all the records that you put into the fuzzy match tool and for all the fields that you want to match on, there's a key that's generated. Key generation is its own whole topic. It's not something Alteryx made up. In fact, we almost exclusively use pre-existing methodologies for generating keys with a few tweaks here and there. But it is a way to take a text value and represent it in a series of characters. And that's really it. So step 1, generate keys for all the records and all the fields. Step 2, identify which records have the same keys. So if you have 3 fields, if you have records that have the same 3 keys from those 3 fields, they'd be considered a match on key. So that's what that all means. So you generate keys for all the records, all the fields, and if all of those keys that are generated for a particular record match, it passes the next filter. Then it gets into fuzzy matching. So then and only then would a record go into the fuzzy matching algorithm. And if it goes into the fuzzy matching algorithm, it has to pass a threshold for each field. So if you're matching on name, address, and zip code, it must pass the threshold for each of those to pass this step. Finally, if the keys matched, if the field thresholds were met, then it must pass the overall threshold, which is a combined score of each individual field threshold. Finally, what comes out there are the matched pairs of record IDs. So again, most common question I get is, why didn't this record come out? And it could be that it failed any one of these 3 tests. It's not simply that it failed the overall threshold. So sometimes you look at a field, it has one character different, and you cannot figure out why that didn't pass your 80% threshold of similarity, and it's probably because it failed on the key generation. So something to keep in mind. It's a multi-step process, and it does happen behind the scenes, so it's sometimes hard to identify. But hopefully by watching the different training content, you'll be able to do that. Finally, that key generation process actually introduces duplicates into the process, something I cover in another training. But because of that, if you ever have a fuzzy match tool on your canvas, ever, it should have a unique after it. So by default, if you put a fuzzy match tool on your canvas, you should put a unique tool right after it, and you should unique on record ID and the other record ID. So that will give you a unique set of matches. So for instance, myself might match to myself multiple times because of kind of some of the features of the key generation process makes that happen. So you can learn why, but just don't forget that there will be duplicates that come out of the fuzzy match process, and it doesn't mean it's a bad match. It doesn't mean anything happened badly. You just need to dedupe and you'll be good. Okay? All right, so with that, again, I checked and I don't see any questions, so I think I'm going to get right into the training. So if you have that workflow available and you want to open it up to follow along, please feel free to do that. All right. So I have my blank canvas here. First step in any workflow is to go ahead and bring in the data. So in my case, I have two data sets, as I mentioned. One is that main set of customer data. Connect to that. You'll see here zip code, address, first name, last name. And the second data set is my new customer data. Address, zip code, last name, first name. Okay, my two data sets. Now, traditionally, if you were trying to see any sort of matches between this, and you don't need to follow along, I'm just going to show you. What I could do is use the standard join tool, and I could match on my fields, on all four of my fields, just do a straight join. I could run this workflow, and what you'd see is I end up getting only 5 records that match exactly, and I get excuse me, over 1,000 that fall out from my main file, and I get almost 1,000 that fall out from my new file. So that's just with the join. According to an exact match join, 5 of these customers are duplicates. That's why we're doing fuzzy matching today. I have a feeling that more than 5 out of 900 are matches. So I'm going to delete that tool because today we're focusing on fuzzy matching. And I'm going to walk you through the steps that are necessary to ensure that you get the best result from your fuzzy match tool. And step 1, as I mentioned, is in the preparation category, and it's the record ID tool. So I'm going to place a record ID tool on the main data, and I'm going to let it start at 1. I'm fine with that, and I'll leave all the other configurations the same. And I'm going to add a record ID tool to the second file, and I'm going to start this one at 500,000. There isn't much strategy here besides I want to ensure that they don't overlap. So if I was being really thorough, it would make sense to go ahead and run the workflow once just to ensure you could see here I have 1,000 records. So obviously, if I start this at 500,000, they're not going to overlap. I have seen tips and tricks online from other Alteryx users and partners where they actually create a record ID from a combination of fields, and that's perfectly fine method. And if you come up with a way to ensure that you have unique identifiers, feel free to do that. All right, the next step is going to be kind of assigning the source or letting the workflow know, the fuzzy match tool, where these data come from. So I'm going to do that with the formula tool. I'll pull that onto my canvas. I'm going to create a brand new field called source, and it's going to be a text field. And I'm going to say this is my original data. So this is letting the fuzzy match tool know this is the original file, these records that come from here. And then I'll do a little cheat here, and I'm going to right-click, copy, right-click, paste that formula tool. And I'll call the second file new. This source field is only necessary if you're trying to match 2 files. If you only have 1 file that you're trying to dedupe, you do not need a source field. All right. Now, if I run this and I look at the data coming out, things are looking good. I have my record ID, I have my source, I have record ID, I have source. My data is pretty clean, so I don't have a whole lot to do here, but this might be a time where you would do your replacement of different things. Maybe you have certain words you want to replace with other words, like you have some sort of internal dictionary that you'd like to use. Feel free to do all that now. Use a select tool if you want to get rid of columns that you're not going to use in the match. All of my fields are going to be used in the match, so I don't need to do any deselecting, but it's a really common time to do that. And now we get to the first quirk of the fuzzy match tool. So although it is in the join category, and although we are trying to merge two files, unlike the join tool, which you see here with two inputs, the fuzzy match tool only has one input. We have two streams of data, but only one input. And this quirk about the tool, this requirement, is why we have to specify a source field. And that's because what the fuzzy match tool expects is one stream of data with all of your records. And the way to do that when you have two different streams of data is with a union tool. So I'm going to bring a union tool onto the canvas, and I'm going to connect both of my data streams. And this will allow me to have both data sets in one stream of data, but I still know which set they came from because of the source field that we created. Okay, so the expectation of the fuzzy match tool having all data in one stream is why we need source field. Now, with any time you use a union, best practice is to, in my opinion, click manually configure fields, make sure that everything's lining up the way you expected. My field names are almost identical, so everything lined up perfectly. If that happens, great, and you can go back to auto config by name or position. And if it doesn't happen perfectly for your data, you have a couple options. You can rename the fields before the union to make them match, or you can use the manually configure fields to move the fields around and stack them. I'm going to stick with manually configure by name, auto configure, excuse me. I will run this, make sure I don't get any issues, no warnings, anything like that, so I look good. You can see kind of a preview of the data here. In fact, you can see all of it, all the records combined. Everything looks great. Now, this is the step where I do a lot of my data cleansing. Once I get the records into the same stream, this just, I feel like, is a little bit more efficient. I'm able to do any sort of deletes or replacements across both files. Of course, if the rules are different for your different files, you could do it ahead of time in this stream. Completely up to you. And this is where I'm going to pull out the data cleansing tool. So in the preparation category, I have my data cleansing tool. I'm going to drag it on the canvas. And I'm going to choose which fields I want to cleanse. And in my case, I'll just stick with all of them because I'm going to do very, very, very basic things. I'm going to make sure that any blanks, any nulls get replaced with blanks. I don't think I have any nulls, but in case I do, I'm going to get with blanks for consistency. I'm going to get rid of leading or trailing white spaces, any tabs, line breaks, or duplicate white spaces. This would be a perfectly fine time to get rid of punctuation if you wanted to. I'm going to show another option in a second, but that's a great time to do that. And I'm going to make all of my fields uppercase. In the past, like years ago, the fuzzy match tool was more sensitive to case. I have found over the years, due to, I guess, code changes behind the scenes, it's less sensitive, but to me, it's always a best practice to ensure anytime you're doing a join or a fuzzy match, that your case is consistent across your data. Just, again, tips and tricks. All right, so that's pretty basic configuration there. I'll run that workflow, and I will look at my output and kind of just give it a once over, and everything looks good to me. So I think I am good to go. Now, also, this would be a great time if you subscribe to the address data to pull out a cast tool and do that address standardization. Okay. So, pretty basic, but I just can't stress enough how important this is in order to get expected results. But with all of that, we're now ready to bring the fuzzy match tool onto the canvas. So I will go to my join category, I will drag that tool out and place it on the workflow. I will choose if I'm deduping or if I'm joining. In my case, I'm joining, so I'll choose merge. As soon as I choose merge, notice that source becomes necessary. So I will ensure that I point it to source. And what that means is exactly what this says. Only records that are in different sources are going to be compared. So records that are in main data are not going to be compared to each other. Records that are new data are not going to be compared to each other, only across the sources. Record ID field is always mandatory, so it selected the right field there, so I'll leave that. And then I will say, if I was asked how to configure this tool setting menu, I would put this very last because it's the last thing I do. So I'm going to jump to the match fields, and I'm going to specify which columns in my data I want to use to match these two data sets. The first one that I want to utilize is going to be address. Okay. Now, again, today I'm focusing on the pre-configured match styles, so I'm going to pick the one that most fits with my address data. I'm familiar with my address data, and I know that this address option is the best fit, though you can see here other options, and again, in the help file, you can get tips and tricks on how to choose between those. And I'm going to, at this point, move on to my next field. So it's really it can be that simple. Match addresses, like just imagine like a join, except for I'm going to use this match style of address. We'll talk more about it, but for now I'll leave it. And I'm ready to move on to my next field, which is going to be zip code. And lucky me, I have a zip code algorithm. Next, I want to match on last name. And lucky me, I have an algorithm that's good for names. And finally, I want to match on first name. And name would be appropriate for first name. That'd be perfectly fine. Name with nicknames is a handy algorithm to have available. And that's actually the one I want to use. But this will be the one instance where I recommend a modification to the standard setting for the match style, the pre-configured match style, and I'll talk about that. So I'm going to choose name with nicknames. If you're just following along and want to see how different algorithms match differently, feel free to choose name. And in theory, at this point, I could be done. I could just be completely done. And if I was done and I ran my workflow, what you'd see is the results out of these 2,000 records that went in. I had 887 matches. And you saw how easy that was to configure. I did nothing but choose my pre-configured match styles, nothing at all. And I got 87 matches, or 887. Now, notice those first four. I know they're only record IDs, which I warned you about. That's the only thing that comes out of the tool by default. But I can clearly see that those two records match each other 4 times. Again, I talk about why this happens in another training, and it's all related to the way keys are generated. It's very cool, very exciting stuff. But that's why it's so important that anytime you use a fuzzy match tool, the very next tool you put on the canvas should always be a unique tool found in the preparation category. And unique on both of those fields, record ID and record ID 2. And now, if I still do nothing else at all and I run this workflow, you'll see that I end up with 583 unique matches. So with hardly any effort on my part, I was able to take 938 records and identify that 583 of them are already contained in my main data set. So if you want to talk about bang for your buck, the fuzzy match tool is set up in a way that you can often, not always, but you can often get a lot of bang for your buck with minimal effort. Use pre-configured match styles. As long as you follow my advice on prepping your data, this could be a huge benefit in whatever sort of manual process you're doing today to try to find duplicates or matches within different data sets. Okay, so as I say, easy peasy. Now, of course, I could talk about fuzzy matching for probably a whole day. So what I'm not doing is downplaying the complexity of the process. I just want to point out that there's a lot of work done for you. And if you do what you're supposed to prep, you can really get good quality information from this tool without in-depth knowledge and without a lot of effort. Okay, but now let's talk about how to get the tool to do what you want. And I'll just touch on a few different options. So one thing, kind of what I always do every time I do a fuzzy match tool, I always output the match score which is going to actually tell me how similar the matches are. Right now, I just know that they're matches, but I don't know how close were they. I also oftentimes like to output the keys. Today, I'm not going to talk a lot about keys, so I'm going to leave that off for now, but it doesn't really hurt anything if you want to look at it. It will actually help you explain the duplicates that you saw. You can output records that don't match, all sorts of options. Don't compare records in a group. This is about processing efficiencies. It's only relevant for a purge. What it means is, for instance, let's say I look at these, let's say record 381 matches to 57 over here, and let's say that 57 matches to 28 down here. If those three records are tied together by the match to 57, 381 and 28 are never going to be compared. So it makes the tool do less work, but it only is relevant on a purge, because in this case, these two records are never going to be compared to each other, and these two records are never going to be compared to each other. So it doesn't matter if these match, they're never going to be part of a group because they don't compare in the same table. So that's why it's only purge, that check mark there. And then also you can use this tool just to simply generate keys for data. There are use cases for that I won't go into today, but that's an option. Okay, so that's step number 1, output match score. Step number 2 is to set a threshold overall. Assuming all of these thresholds are appropriate, what is the overall similarity that I want between my data fields? The default's 80. That's pretty high. When I'm doing fuzzy matching, I usually set it pretty low to begin with, and then I go look at the data, the results, to try to decide if I'm comfortable with the threshold or not. I feel like you can always filter out false positives if you want to, but if you don't lower the threshold, you'll never really know what's down there. I also find that by looking at those kind of low match results, it can help me identify data issues that I can address before the fuzzy match tool that will then allow me to get, like I said, more value out of the fuzzy process. So again, just a tip and trick, but I like to start low and then kind of go high. Okay, now that's the overall threshold. The individual field thresholds are also very important. I'll tell you that the default thresholds set wonderful, appropriate settings. You don't need to change them, but if you're ever curious about what these default methodologies look like, you simply hit edit. Now here's a tip and trick, or a beware, whatever you want to call it, a warning. If you click edit, for instance, on the address match, you get to see behind the scenes what's going on. Now, this page can be intimidating. I don't recommend modifying this page until you're pretty comfortable with fuzzy matching, until you've attended all of our online trainings and looked at the community for discussions. But if you do go here, even if you don't change anything, I haven't touched anything. If I click OK, the match style changes to custom. Now, I'm not a developer. I didn't create this tool. In my opinion, it'd be better if it didn't change to custom unless you actually change something. I'm sure there's something behind the scenes that makes that not appropriate or possible. And I do get why this happens. It's because you should be very aware if you've changed something so that you know later if the fuzzy match tool isn't doing what you want, it's because you potentially modified the algorithm. So what I recommend is if you do click edit, so I changed it back to address. If you do click edit, click cancel here if you don't want to change anything, and then it will show you that it's still the default setting. Okay? So hopefully that made sense. Now, the one thing I recommend everybody considering modifying is the match threshold here at the bottom. So as I said, it sets perfectly fine thresholds. I find them to be a bit stringent. So I regularly will come into a pre-configured match style and lower the threshold. Like for instance, for an address, maybe I'm comfortable with the address being 75% in common with the other match. All of this stuff we're not going to go into today for this particular match threshold. Now, match weight, this is how important this field score is in the overall threshold. So it's really like a weighted average. It takes the scores from each field, averages them together, and that's how you get the overall score. So keep that in mind. So for instance, I could set this to 50, and it could pass the address threshold, and as long as the other field scores are higher than 50, the overall threshold could be over 60. So it's very important that you are aware that the filters are every single threshold. So it has to pass this threshold and this threshold and this one and this one and this one. It has to pass every single one in order to pass through. So just be aware of that kind of interaction between the thresholds. Okay, so all I did here, the only thing I did was change this to 75. I'm going to leave zip code completely alone, but I'll just show you, edit here. What it's doing is actually a key match only, which means it's not fuzzy at all. It is literally taking only digits, and it's taking 5, the first 5 digits of this field, and that's what it's matching on, period. No fuzzy anything. Now, that said, if that field had 7 characters, it would only take the first 5, and it would match on that. So it's still not necessarily an exact match. It's only exact up to the first 5 digits. Excuse me. So again, part of the complexity between this 2-step process, the key generation and the match function, they are very related to each other, but they are separate. Okay, so I'm going to hit cancel here because again, I didn't change anything. Last name, I'm perfectly fine with. I'll hit edit in case I want to lower this threshold, and I do. I'm comfortable with last name being 80% similar. So that's the only thing I'll change there. And finally, one of my favorite pre-configured algorithms is name with nicknames. And I'll go ahead and click edit so you can kind of see what's involved there. In this case, I am going to talk a little bit more about the 2-step process. Step 1, okay, well really it's 3 steps because the very first step is pre-processing. By default, the fuzzy match tool actually strips punctuation for you, depending on the algorithm you choose. So that's why I didn't select that option, the data cleansing tool. I mean, I could see you arguing it either way. If you want to do it ahead of time, if you want to let the tool do it, it's completely up to you. But stripping punctuation in the fuzzy match tool will help both the key generation portion potentially and the match function for sure. So just keep that in mind that that does happen, and you can even do some more pre-processing. So this happens before pre-processing, before key generation, and before match function. Now, key generation, as I said earlier, it's a way of kind of reducing a value into a code pretty much, and there are different algorithms for doing that. You can see the different methods here. Again, go to the help file, go to the other training, I'll show you. Not going to cover that today. The one thing I'm going to talk about though is the name with nickname table that's part of the match function. What some people don't realize is that, and I've already talked about it, it's that this match function is only utilized, it's only applied if and only if the keys match each other first. So the keys that are generated between 2 records have to match, and if and only if that happens, then the fuzzy match tool is used. So this common nickname table, which is part of the default configuration, is available to you, which will take names like Dave and David, Mike and Michael, you know, all sorts of things. You can go look at the table. It's available in your Alteryx install. And it will say if the records have a Mike and a Michael, it's going to say, rather than trying to fuzzy match them, it's not going to fuzzy match them because they're not the same. Mike and Michael would hardly pass any fuzzy matching algorithm because they're like, what, 50% similar, something like that. So what it does, instead of trying to fuzzy match them, it just says, look, they're in the nickname table. I'm going to assign a penalty of 15%. So those 2 records would come out with an 85. So 50% penalty, they'd come out with 85. You can change the penalty. You could say 30 penalty for nickname match, and it'd come out with a 70. You could say a 5% and it'd come out with a 95. It's completely up to you how bad you think a nickname match is. You get to decide that. And for nicknames, it won't fuzzy match. But then for any fields that are not in the nickname, or for any records that are not in the nickname table, it will actually do the fuzzy algorithm, and it will assign the actual like similarity score. So again, for first name, I'm going to lower it. And I have a strange first name, Kaylin, spelled strangely. So I am very aware of how poorly people are able to hear my name and spell it in databases. So I always have first name really low. Because in my opinion, if your address is the same, your last name is the same, and your first name is some really bad spelling, you know, I think 50% similarity is great. Now, the one weird thing that I'm going to do, and taken out of context, this could be dangerous, so please hear this with caution. I'm going to think about nickname like Bill, a very common nickname for the name William. If you know anything about key generation, or if you just go Wikipedia, key generation, you're going to see that a word like William is going to have a dramatically different key than a word like Bill. One starts with the W and has multiple syllables. One starts with the B and has one syllable. They will not have the same key. They won't ever have the same key. And since key generation and key match happens before fuzzy match, Bill and William will never, not ever in a million years will they pass through as a match in this default configuration. So perhaps names like Dave and David, they could potentially pass because they at least start with the same sound. But this key length here 4 tells me that pretty much any nickname, which is almost always a shortened version of the real name, this key length is going to pretty much ensure that the full name has a longer key than the nickname does, because syllables and sounds matter in key generation. So the default configuration actually makes you think nicknames are going to be considered, but they're really not, because most nickname-name combinations fall out of the key process. So hopefully you're thinking, okay, well, A, what are we going to do about it? And B, why did they set up this configuration in this way? And I'll answer both. What we're going to do about it is we're going to change the key generation process to none. We're just not going to generate keys. We're going to say for first name, I don't care what the key is. Don't even look at the key for first name. Which means, what that literally means is everything passes through. Every single first name will be compared to every other single first name. And what I just said is the reason why that's not the default setting. There are times where you have a data set and you may only have one field to match on, just one single field you're matching on. And if you had millions of records you're trying to match, fuzzy matching is such a processing intensive algorithm that it's beyond not a good practice. It's just unacceptable. The tool will actually not let you run a fuzzy match without a key generated, at least one key. So that means if you only have one field, you have to generate a key for that field, because the tool insists that you have at least one key generated so that it can filter down potential matches based on really good logic, which is key generation. That's great logic for finding potential matches. They don't have to be exact to pass the key generation. They just have to be similar. And then it'll actually compare fuzzy. So that's why every single pre-configured algorithm has a key generated. And the only time that I recommend not generating keys is with names. And that's because it's so common for people to hear names wrong, misspell them. Nicknames are common. It's like the only time where not doing that initial pass-through is reasonable. And what's good is that from that filtering process, that funnel I showed you, the nice thing is that these other 3 fields all have keys generated. So you don't have to worry that every first name is going to get compared to every other first name. Only the first names of the records that already passed these 3 will get compared. So not generating a key here really doesn't hurt me, because I have these other 3 doing that kind of filtering work for me. This is recorded, so go back and listen to that whole spiel again. I'm going to move on for today, but that's kind of like my big takeaway for today is name with nicknames, don't generate keys, but pretty much there's no other reason to ever do that. Okay. Whew. Okay, so that's my configuration for the fuzzy match tool. Now I'll run this one more time. It's not exciting. I now have a lot more matches though, 943 that come out of the fuzzy match, and I have 806 that come out of the unique process. And you can see the match scores now. Zip code doesn't show up because it's not a fuzzy process. As you saw, it's a key match only, so there's no score to be had. It either matched or it didn't. All right, now this is great. I have my results. I now know that record 201 matches 500, 134. Fantastic, except I can't see that. I can't verify that that's a good match. I don't have my original data. And that is the last step of my process, is to join back the original data so that I can actually look at the matches and what I had before. This is the part of the process that I find to be the least intuitive, and I'll move quickly to ensure that we have time for questions. But just know you have the workflow to see how I did it. You can watch the recording, and it's a two-step process. So step one, I'm going to join back my original data, so address, first name, last name, and I'm going to do that with the join. I am literally going to take a join tool, connect it to my deduped match, and I'm going to add, and you can decide if you want to, if you did a bunch of data cleansing, it's up to you. Do you want to go back to the original file, or do you want to use your cleansed data? It really is your choice. Sometimes you have fields you want to get back from the original file. I'm just going to connect it from here. So I'm literally saying, take my matches and join back the fields from the original file. And the original file, if you recall, has the small IDs. And the small IDs out of the fuzzy match are here in record ID. This is why we have them not overlap, so that the big ones are always over here in record ID 2 and the small ones are always over here in record ID. Again, remember that as a tip and trick, and you can dig more into it later. But because of that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take in this join, and I'm going to say from the left, which is my fuzzy match, take record ID, and from the right, match record ID. And you'll see here very clearly I get all of my fields. Fantastic. I don't really need this record ID to show up twice, so I'm going to deselect that. And then I'm going to bring another join tool. Well, I'll run this once so you can see. So what comes out of this join are my match stuff that you already saw come out of the fuzzy match, and now the fields that came out of the original file. You can see here, original. Great, fantastic. And I want to compare those to the new data. So I'm going to bring out another join tool, and I'm going to say, take what I just created, the joined data, and this time append the columns from the new file. Now, the new file has the big IDs. The big IDs are in the new file, and coming out of this unique, the big IDs are in record ID 2, the matched record ID. So in the join, I'm going to say from the left side, join on record ID 2, the big one. And from the original file, it's called record ID. The only reason it gets renamed to 2 is because the fuzzy match tool forces a duplicate field and it renames it to 2, which is actually a warning you get. When you anytime you use a fuzzy match tool, you'll always have at least one warning you that you had record ID twice, it created a second one. This is what this two join process is dealing with. Again, you have the workflow. You can rewatch this recording to kind of get that. But the one thing I'm going to do down here is to make my life easier. Again, I'm going to get rid of this duplicate record ID, but I'm actually going to move my fields. So I want to stack my fields where they're visible together. So I'm going to right click on the right address, and I'm going to move it up by the left address. I'm going to right click on last name. I'm going to move it up by last name. I'm going to right click on first name and move it up by first name. Zip code, I don't really care. It's pretty much an exact match. I'm not going to spend a lot of time looking at that. Also, what you'll see if you extend this is you have match scores for each one. So if you want, you can move the match score for address by address, for last name by last name, and for first name by first name. Okay, so really, I'm just reorganizing my fields so that I can see what I want when I run this workflow. Now, it's up to you at this point to decide how you want to look at the data. What I normally do is I throw a couple of sorts into the workflow. And for instance, I'll sort by match score. I like to do descending. And I'll throw another sort on there to do match score first name, for instance. I'll just stop there, but you could do a sort on last name. And this is just a way for me to analyze my scores to see what I'm comfortable with. So if I run this now, I can see my data sorted by, so this is the address one, so I'm going to look at the address data only for now. So you can see at the top, these all matched 100%. And as I scroll down, you'll see some matched at 99. So they are super close. My threshold, I think, was like 75 or something. Clearly, my address data is very good because this has been CAS certified, if I remember correctly. So I don't have bad addresses really here. So I'm perfectly fine with my threshold of 75. No big deal. Now, if I look at first name, this could be a little bit more interesting. What you'll see here, you may notice some fake data. My apologies. You'll see here that names like Roger, Dina, all these match at 100. Scroll, scroll, scroll. I start to see some 90s, Kristen and Kristen, Rachel and Rachel, 89. Now here's some 85s. Oh, right there. We get Mandy and Amanda. They would have had extremely different keys. Thankfully, we didn't do keys. Will and William, because one's shorter than the other, they would have actually had different keys as well. John, Jonathan, Ron and Ronald, kind of so on down the list. You can see how that nickname option is really helping our match results. Now, anything that's lower than 85 would be for sure a fuzzy match because the 85 is that default setting for nicknames. You can see John and John, David and David Jr., Sean, different spellings of Sean. This one actually ended up passing the key. Sorry, it's not in the nickname table or else it would have got an 85, but fuzzy matching, it still passed the 70. And so, of course, as you start going here, you can decide if there are any false positives. Like, for instance, Kaylin and Colin, maybe those are husband and wife at a certain house. I don't know. You could decide that going forward, you only want to have first name threshold set to 70 so that these false positives fall out. That might be a change you make based on kind of eyeballing the results. So again, join everything back together and then really start to analyze it to decide if you want to go back to the fuzzy match tool and make modifications. So with that, I've built out the workflow to completion, and I want to make sure that before we close out, I at least show you guys on the website where you can see the other content. So if you go to alteryx.com, resources, training, under virtual training, watch a past session. So here's today's session, watch a past session. You can search through here, and what you'll see is there's actually fuzzy matching training. It's listed as advanced category. Hopefully after today you kind of see why. There's a lot involved, very complex, even at the easiest. But you'll be able to go watch and look at a different workflow and a different PowerPoint that will help kind of guide you through the details of the inner workings of the tool. So today, again, was more about prep and just kind of basic best practices, and you can investigate the details of these algorithms and more with some of our other content. So with that, I really appreciate you guys following along, and I'm open to questions that you may have. And I'm looking through. I see you guys have been asking a couple of questions that it looks like we've answered. I don't believe, still scrolling. Okay, oh great. All right, well, the only other thing that I want to mention is that fuzzy matching questions are very often not black and white. So if you go home, if you're at home or at work and you go build a process, then don't get the results you want. The community is a perfect place to talk about this because from a support perspective, which I'm going to get to here in my kind of closing slides, we have great support resources and our support team is ready and willing and able to help you with fuzzy matching. But a lot of times it's really kind of up for debate what you should do when the fuzzy match tool didn't do exactly what you wanted with the basic settings. So we can talk to you about theory, we can give you resources, but I find that talking it out loud with another person, just kind of discussing why you might do one or the other or asking them how they did it, how did they get the results they wanted, what are kind of pitfalls they found, can be really, really valuable with a process like fuzzy matching. So please go to the community, utilize the training resources, and then if that doesn't get you what you need, feel free to reach out to our support channels. You will have a survey after this to tell us if you're satisfied or give us tidbits and let us know what we can do better in the future. And with that, again, thank you so much. And I'll stay on the line if anybody has final questions. Otherwise, have a good rest of the day.